Hello, my poetic, angelic philosopher friends. I am here to talk about this book that I just finished not too long ago called On Beauty and Being Just by Elaine Scarry. There are YouTube channel videos about this topic in this book, specifically her talking about it, and I would definitely recommend them because she is a really great live speaker as well. So this book is in two parts. It was published by Princeton University Press in 1999. Part 1 is on beauty and being wrong, and part 2 is on beauty and being fair. And her main thesis is that beauty should be redeemed, and I do agree that it needs to be redeemed, because specifically it points us toward justice. If what is just is beautiful, and going back to the Greek word kalan for beauty, which also means nobility, so ugliness would not be the only opposition to beauty, since there is the idea of nobility. What is not beautiful is also base, so also lowly. And one of the critiques that she's trying to redeem beauty from is that beauty is distracting us from what is important in it seems like sort of a romanticizing way. If we are, and even maybe the romantics with a capital R, if we see suffering in the world, instead of trying to correct it, maybe we're sort of hopeless in that sense. And hold on, I'm going to lift up my computer. I don't know where the microphone is. Okay, just to make sure the sound works. Instead of that, we may turn to, let's say, art, which is the other major topic in the philosophy of aesthetics, beauty and art. So we turn to art, or we turn to seeking beauty, we turn to our imagination and our fantasies, dreaming of, a liminal, minimalistic kind of heavenly state where everything is perfect and we have control over everything. And it lifts us into the clouds out of real life, which we should be focusing on, because we want to make the world better. This is one of Nietzsche's critiques of religious ideas of the afterlife and immortality of the soul, because it takes us away from looking at the world and reality as it is. It instead of, for Nietzsche, his main idea, or his main value or virtue, if you can call it that, is amor fati, the love of fate. Being a yes-sayer is a part of his, free spirit personality. And so he says that religion specifically, but even art, can be looked at in this way. It is life-denying instead of life-affirming. It consoles us when true art and true beauty is embodied and situated, and it contains the ugly and the base. So if you think about artists, they don't shy away from the mundane or the ugly or the shocking. They embrace all of it and find beauty in all of it. And so, I think that is a part of the conversation. But Elaine Scarry says that we have to know what is beautiful and be excited about beauty and value it in order to see the contrasting ugliness of injustice. So that's really what I think she is saying and going for. The first part of her book is about how we misperceive and misunderstand beauty. So it's not just, and also trying to define what beauty is. So for her, maybe I'll start with what beauty is. So first, she looks at Plato's Symposium and Diotima's idea that when you are in a beautiful relationship with the world and with other people, you produce you have a metaphysical pregnancy, which is creative. You are contemplating the form of beauty eventually as you go up the ladder of love or eros. And your mind is turned toward this form, but you first, look at, kind of going back to what I was talking about, and Elaine is Scarry is talking about. You're first turned by, even though it's the lowest level, beautiful bodies, even one beautiful body that you're attracted to. And it moves you toward higher and higher sort of spaces and levels and realms. So she says that, number one, what beauty is, she says what it is, we know it by its effect, and it is generative. She says that it's also expansive, which she's going to connect a distributive property to the justice conversation, thinking about equality and distributing goods, etc. It's expansive. So maybe one of the critiques is that beauty keeps us hyper-focused and fixated on one particular object or subject to deny the rest of the world. But Elaine Scarry says that's not really what happens when we encounter beauty. When we encounter beauty, we are, yes, in awe, and the singular or particular is a part of beauty and awakening to it. But she says it's expansive, and this is a part of the begetting as well. We want to continue seeing beauty and feeling beauty because it feels purifying, it feels enlightening, it feels energetic. And it's a pleasurable experience when we are in the midst of beautiful architecture or a beautiful landscape or even a beautiful person. And what this inspires us, it's almost like the beautiful object or subject is our muse. And we then, as an artist, this goes back to Nietzsche's aesthetic justification of life, we want to paint the beautiful sunset that we see, or the beautiful rose that we're obsessed with, that has withered away already, or the, beautiful person that we saw, out on the train or something, or in another country that we'll never see again, but we want to reproduce this. And then, but it heightens and incites our own sensitivity toward beauty. So we start to be seekers of beauty as well as creators of it. And we seek it out looking for it. And that helps us correct one of the two errors that Scarry talks about. One of them is, when we lose beauty, but the other is when we awaken to it. And so maybe we were asleep toward the beauty in the world, the magnificent, universal, cosmopolitan, everyday beauty in the world. Well, we start seeing it. We start thinking, oh, it's not just this rare, sort of sublime, uplifting event. She's also going to call it sacred and salvific. But our morning tea, this as the steam rises from the cup of Earl Grey, or the lavender clouds that I'm seeing everywhere in the sky now that I've not noticed before. The beauty of holding a book and feeling the sun on your bare flesh, the feeling of how cozy it is to get into a bed of all your summer sheets and light blankets and feel the breeze from the open window at night. Like, you start embodying the beauty of your life. And so, this can relate to justice, because maybe we want being sensitive, sort of pursuers of beauty. We really want the world to be beautiful, and we want it to be beautiful for everyone. Elaine Scarry also incorporates John Rawls' sort of thought experiment about the veil of ignorance, and the question, what kind of world would you create, not knowing who you would be incarnated as, where you would live, your economic status, etc. And she says that it's quite likely that performing this thought experiment and asking questions about beauty, for instance, would we elect to have on the world beautiful gardens that we might never see, but other people will experience? And she makes the claim that yes, unanimously, we would still want that to exist. Furthermore, we would still, and she says this despite how beauty itself is misunderstood and disregarded, which I'll get into that as well. She says that we would choose for everyone to value beauty. And, there are scientific studies about neighborhoods with extra green space versus a lack of green space, more of a concrete jungle, and how nature, which is often cited alongside with art, affects the lack or the presence of it affects our mental health. I love living in Colorado, seeing the mountains everywhere, and having such a high elevation where the sky is so dynamic. That kind of leads me, that descriptive little caveat there, leads me to describing another sort of part of her book, content and format wise. She also, as she's writing this, talks about, sort of goes into reveries about the paintings that she has of Matisse on her wall, or, the particular trees that are outside her veranda or balcony or whatever it is. And she this book is, I think, it's not that long. It's about 130 pages. It is a meditation on beauty, and she really takes time to slow down and talk about her sort of encounter with beauty's seductions, specifically nature and art, I think in hopes of giving us, the reader, that experience, which I think, is really interesting. She says that, we can't discount beauty, and now I'll get into more of the wrong or the errors of it. We can't discount it just because we have sometimes miseducated versions or understandings of beauty. Sometimes we have an imperfect version. So she talks about, going back to the begetting or the mimicry or the sort of narrow focus. She talks about, yes, how sometimes we can sort of mimic fashion trends, beauty trends. We can mimic starlets, or I don't know if she talks about this so much, but my thought was that one of the shadow sides of beauty is that we can sort of get over attached to becoming beauty instead of thinking of it more as a feeling, an encounter, a relationship. We can want to become beautiful, and we can be self-destructive in pursuing that sort of archetype of, Aphrodite or, one of the Greek gods. So being like an Adonai or an Apollo. So I think that is really interesting because, another one of my experiences with the critique of beauty is that people will call it superficial. Like, that isn't important. Trying to be beautiful, or there's some sort of contempt connected to it, especially with women who are wanting to dress beautifully or wearing makeup or wearing wigs or something like this. I think usually it's not the what, but the how, like how we are doing it. But, I've seen sort of there's this trend against beauty that, you shouldn't try to deceive people by wearing makeup. And the other side of it, though, is that makeup is beautifying, and it takes effort, it takes time, it takes skill, it takes artistry, and it can be a form of art and personal expression and personality, which, Nikolai Berdyaev says is the highest sort of value for human beings, our personality and our expression. Not to say that, you can't be beautiful in sort of having like a naked face and being bare and natural and, glowy and whatever. You can. And that's the thing about beauty. And if we value beauty and we value aesthetics and art, we are automatically then valuing the diversity of tendencies and inclinations. So, and then I guess the other thing that, and this is what I don't think she really mentions, she doesn't go into, I don't think she takes seriously enough, is the objectification or the reification of the beloved. Again, she's going to break this down to, just particular people, like maybe a minority. And furthermore, she says just because beauty has sometimes, or beautiful people, a flower that's beautiful that you destroy by plucking it, even though beauty has been made a victim, doesn't mean that we should discount beauty and have disregard for it because of the sort of abusers of beauty. But I do think, especially with, she doesn't ever use the word muse, but it made me think of, why are we inspired? Why do we become artists when we see something beautiful or someone beautiful? The problematic nature of the muse. And I do think that beauty should be protected because it is exploited, especially when you're thinking about people. And she really does she does break down, the categories of beauty and, look at the sight of persons as the main problematic, which I do appreciate. But how does that really enter into the conversation? It doesn't necessarily take away from the redemption of beauty, which ultimately, as I said, I agree with and I think should be pursued. But again, I would have liked her to take more seriously the harm that beautiful objects and subjects endure. Often, I think, because of possession, projection, the shadows of the unconscious in the collective and in the individual, and so on. So because that, in a book that's about justice and on ethics, that is important to the ethics of aesthetics. Kind of dealing with that and trying to unpack it and figure it out. I had an experience of someone that I was staying with. I think it was more so staying with his friend. But I did stay at his place once because I was backpacking through Europe and just being hosted by a bunch of different people. Thus, as you do when you're backpacking, you live partly in hostels, and then I was doing Workaway, and there was a site, I don't know if it's there anymore, called couchsurfing.com. And we were at dinner. This was I think it was in Mallorca or Menorca. We went both places. One of those islands. He said to me that, he thinks of me as his muse. And I was so surprised. And I realized in that moment how separated someone might be. The experience of witnessing a muse is wholly sometimes in the perspective of the perceiver, because I didn't feel like a muse. I had to try to historically retrace our experience and our encounter together to figure out how that could be. But maybe just because I was, I don't know, a young American woman just traveling in Europe, I don't know, being adventurous. I still don't know. I haven't really thought much about it. I remember just the confusion and the surprise when he told me that. But overall, I would say that I really enjoyed this book and would very much recommend it. And I'm going to look at what other books she has written and published or papers, because I think she's a really good writer as well. One thing that I would have loved her also to talk about, besides, the points thus discussed, is the feeling of beauty, because that's where I think beauty really is. And she sort of indirectly talks about it because, seeing something or someone beautiful inspires us to create as artists. And so there has to be some kind of internal feeling that we have. But I think feeling beautiful is also an ethical response to the idea and the concept of beauty. For instance, as opposed to the self-destructive seeking of becoming beautiful, thinking of it more as a daimon, of like Eros is a daimon in the Symposium, and that comes to visit you, and you get to sort of be heightened by that feeling. And it could come from, a relationship that helps you embody the version of yourself that you love. Sometimes we have those relationships, and that might incorporate projection, though. But as one of my friends say, maybe we can never not project. I don't know. But, when you are dancing in your apartment to some music that really inspires you, and you feel beautiful, and it's not about looking in the mirror or, any sort of physical kind of attribute. You feel it. The feeling of beauty is a feeling of, I think, groundedness, but also connection to the divine and the sacred. It's a feeling of self-worth and self-love and radical self-acceptance. And it's also a dance and a rhythm and a movement of your body and sensuality as well. So I don't know. I mean, I am also preoccupied with beauty, especially as it is connected to Eros, which I can't necessarily yet explain how beauty and Eros are connected, but I think that they are, and they certainly are in Plato's Symposium, right? Because the Symposium is a story of various men getting together and composing these encomia to Eros, the god, which then Socrates reports that Diotima says is not a god, but a daimon, an intermediary. And just reading about, what Hesiod says and the theogony about Eros being a dissolver of flesh, and, Sappho, thinking about like Anne Carson's Sappho, or Eros the Bittersweet, she also wrote, which comes from Sappho, which she did Anne Carson did a translation of. It seems some of the effects that I see, the feelings that I associate with feeling beautiful, is in the house of Eros. But I guess in the realm, the house of Logos as well, thinking about the pre-Socratics and the Aristotelian cosmological architecture being characterized by harmony and order and mathematical musicality and concentric circles, and the shape of the sphere. I guess there's that as well. I guess I'm more interested in that Eros house of beauty. But anyway, I would recommend that you read this, just with the heads up that she does have extended passages of her sort of singing the praises and the recollections of her own encounters with beauty. So you really do have to be in a meditative mind to read those. Otherwise, you might want to skip them for the Logos. But I think she's trying to incorporate the Eros in her book and make the personal sort of universal. Let me know in the comments if you've read the book, or if you're considering reading it, or what you think is interesting about my summary. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope that you all have an experience of beauty and the sublime very soon.